For this section, we're going to be going over the practice strips in Chapter 6 of the ECG Made Easy book, going over ventricular rhythms. I'm not going to be going over all the rhythms, just mainly the ones that have ventricular beats in them. There are some other great practice strips back here that review some of the previous chapters. Alright, so we're going to start with number 25, figure 6.26. The rhythm here is irregular, so you can just put irregular for that. I did just want to point out that the underlying rhythm between the PVCs is very regular. It is sinus in nature. We have P waves for every QRS complex. They are all upright. We have 1-to-1. Our PR intervals within normal limits, and our QRS complexes are narrow. I did measure all those out here for you. I'm not going to go over that with this chapter because we have reviewed it in the previous chapters. So for my rate, I'm just going to use the 6-second technique. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 times 10 gave me 120 beats per minute. Now for our actual patients, we do need to feel a mechanical pulse because sometimes these PVCs do not conduct a mechanical pulse with it. It just depends on how much cardiac filling we had before the PVC was conducted. So it is something we need to check, but for testing purposes, we will always include the PVCs in our rate. Now my PVCs, we can look at it right away and tell that it's pretty wide. I did highlight them for you here in green. To measure a PVC, just go where the QRS complex starts. So I measured out this one here, and then where it ends. So I have my QRS. So this is where the PVC actually does end. The reason we have this huge ST segment depression is because, remember, we are generating a pulse from the ventricles. So in my heart, I'm generating a pulse from somewhere down here, which means I have this backwards reflection of energy going up through the atria. So that's why we get those weird ST segment depression or elevation. Just depends on where in the ventricles our beat is coming from and how that reflection of backwards energy is produced onto the ECG. Now, if you notice, my PVCs do seem to happen in a pattern. So I marked off my beats here. 1, 2, 3, 4 is a PVC. 1, 2, 3, 4. So it's every fourth beat that I'm having a PVC. And again, we know that it's coming from the ventricles because my QRS is so wide. It's 0.16 seconds for small blocks, and that's over that limit of 0.12 seconds. So that's how I know that that beat is coming from the ventricles. We call it a premature ventricular contraction, or PVC, because it does come early. It comes before the next sinus beat would have arrived. Now, with the pattern of every fourth beat, we call that quadreminal PVCs. And I'll move this over so you can see my rhythm interpretation. Quadreminal, quad meaning 4, so it's happening every fourth beat we're having a PVC. Now you can add unifocal in there. We do assume if you have some kind of pattern, whether it be bigeminal, meaning every second beat, trigeminal every third beat, or quadreminal, that they're all coming from the same place because it's happening in such a pattern. If for some reason they were multifocal PVCs, definitely include that in your rhythm interpretation because that's out of normal. But you don't have to put unifocal in there. If you do, being more specific never hurts, so you can definitely put that in there. So sinus tachycardia, because my sinus rhythm is at 120 beats per minute with quadreminal PVCs for my rhythm interpretation. Now looking at the second rhythm, regular or irregular, this rhythm does appear to be very regular. For my rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times 10, gave me that 50 beats per minute. I did not count this because most of the beat is cut off. I have no P waves, so no PR interval. And then measuring my QRS. So I highlighted what just that QRS segment would be. If you look over here, a lot of people want to measure from here to here, and that's actually the QT interval because this is our T wave. Okay, so this would be the T wave. This is our QRS. And it's okay if you can't measure exactly where that is. We can glance at this rhythm and just tell that it is wide in nature. So most of the times we don't actually have to measure these out. And again, we have that huge ST depression because we're getting that backwards reflection of energy through the heart. Because my electrical impulse is coming from down here in the ventricles and it's moving upward through the heart instead of down the heart. Sorry, there's that picture there. So my energy is moving upward through the heart to the atria instead of downward like it usually is. So we get that weird deflection of energy. So it is regular, 50 beats per minute. My QRS, when you measure it out, it's actually 4 blocks. And I measured one right here, so that is 0.16 seconds, which is wider, which lets us know that it's coming from the ventricles. Also, the absence of P waves gives that away. And then we don't have to measure the ST segment since it's ventricular in nature. If you did happen to put ST depression in there, again, just being more specific, so it's not an issue at all. For my interpretation, I have accelerated idioventricular, or some people write it as just accelerated ventricular. As long as the accelerated is in there. I've also seen it accelerated ventricular escape. So whatever you want to write that as, I tend to stick with the idioventricular, accelerated idioventricular at 50 beats per minute. Now it's accelerated because my intrinsic rate, my normal rate of my ventricles is only 20 to 40 beats per minute. So it is accelerated for that pacemaker site, but it's not quite tachycardic because it's not over 100 beats per minute. Moving on to the next page, we're going to start with this first rhythm up here, number 27 or figure 6.28. And what we have here is a whole lot of, not much, so we just kind of have this squiggly line. And what's happening with this is I have fibrillation in my ventricles. So my ventricles are just kind of shaking, they're quivering. And I mean, I'm just getting these little electrical impulses coming from all over. Usually this is caused by some kind of sudden cardiac death. MI would probably be our #1 cause for this. But we can't counter rhythm, we can't counter rates. There's no waves of any kind. So we just call that ventricular fibrillation, and what's just those ventricles are fibrillating. This rhythm is not conducive with life. We have no cardiac output really coming out here at all. No actual beats being conducted, so they will be pulseless. And it's something that needs to be corrected right away. Basically, our electrical activity is just going haywire, and we need to find some way to reset that, is how we fix that. And we'll talk a lot about that when we go over algorithms. So my interpretation, VFib, which is short for ventricular fibrillation. You could also just write VF. Obviously, there's no rate with this one, so we just leave it like that. I'm going to skip down to the last rhythm here. Number 29, or figure 6.3. I'm going to slide this over so we can see all of my interpretation. So rhythm, obviously irregular, mostly because we have these two in here. I wrote here that the underlying is regular just to point out that I do have a regular sinus rhythm happening besides these PVCs. For my rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times 10 gave me that 70 beats per minute. My P waves, obviously I don't have any P waves for my PVCs, my ventricular beats, but I do have for my sinus rhythm a P wave for every QRS complex, and it is upright, and they're all uniform. For my PR interval, I measured on a sinus beat, obviously because I don't have P waves over here, and I got 0.16 seconds. My QRS, I measured for the sinus beat, gave me 0.08. Now, for this, these PVCs, we can measure this QRS complex, so it starts here, ends here, so it is about 5 blocks long, or 0.2 seconds. But again, we can just look at that and see that it's wide, so we don't necessarily always have to measure that out. For my ST segment, I'm looking at my sinus part of my rhythm. So I kind of drew my isoelectric line here. And you can see my J point, my QRS, where my QRS ends, is 2 to 3 blocks below that isoelectric line. So I do have ST segment depression. And I have inverted T waves, which I kind of highlighted that one there, but you can see here my T wave is inverted. So it dips below the isoelectric line instead of being a regular upwards deflection. Now looking at these PVCs here, I have 2 in a row. They are the same. They look very similar, so we call them unifocal, and that just means they're coming from the same place in the ventricle, which is a better thing because we have only 1 irritated site in the ventricle. If we had multifocal, we would have 2 irritated sites in the ventricle. So less irritation, the better. So it is a couplet because it is 2 in a row or a pair together. We call that a couplet. So for my interpretation, I have sinus rhythm, and I had forgotten to put in with inverted T waves and ST segment depression. So sinus rhythm at 70 beats per minute with inverted T waves and ST segment depression with couplet unifocal PVCs. Couplet because there's a pair of 2 together, unifocal because they look similar, and they're premature ventricular contractions. We can tell by the wideness of the QRS complex that they're coming from the ventricles. All right, we're going to be looking at the next page now. And going up to my first rhythm here, number 30 or figure 6.31. This is an irregular rhythm. I have 2 rhythms, so each one is regular, but overall we have irregularity. So if I'm just looking at this section, it's regular. If I'm just looking at this section, it's regular. But we could just put irregular for the whole entire strip as a whole. Now, my rhythm changes right here, which is why I have that line drawn right there. So I need to figure out the rate for each rhythm. So I did count the small blocks over here, and I came up with 16. So my first rate would be 1500 divided by 16, and that's where I got that 94 beats per minute. And then over here, I'm just measuring, this is where my QRS complex starts to where it starts again, and I got 10 blocks. So 1500 divided by 10 gave me that 150 beats per minute. P waves, I do have them on this half. I do have a P wave for every QRS complex. They are all upright, they all look the same. Obviously, we have no P waves over here. We can look at this right away and tell that it's a wide complex ventricular tachycardia. It's a very distinct looking rhythm. So a lot of times it's something we can glance at and say, oh, that's definitely going to be V-tach. The QRS complex I highlighted in green here. So where my QRS, okay, actually is. It's just this little segment. And this is all going to be that kind of weird reflection of that backwards energy. So QRS is actually only from here to here, so it's actually only 4 blocks long. So for this section, it would be 0.16 seconds. Again, we don't usually count out the QRS duration in V-tach because it's a very distinct looking rhythm. We can definitely just look at that and see that it's a V-tach. And sometimes it looks very regular. So my interpretation for this rhythm is going to be sinus rhythm at 94 beats per minute. Sorry, there was a writing error there. Into ventricular tachycardia at 150 beats per minute. And I have that written over here, sorry, so you can see the whole thing. Shorthand for V-tach, we can just write V-tach or VT. It's also referred to as monomorphic ventricular tachycardia. And the opposite of that would be polymorphic ventricular tachycardia, which is another name for torsades de Pointes. All right, going down to the second rhythm here. So this is number 31 or figure 6.32. Overall, my rhythm is very irregular. Now, if I was just looking at this part, this first part, I would say that it's regular. And obviously we have 2 different rhythms here. So just looking at this beginning part, it is a sinus rhythm. I counted 25 blocks between the RR interval, which gave me 1500 divided by 25, gave me that 60 beats per minute. They are sinus beats because I have narrow QRS complexes. I have P waves for every QRS complex, a T wave. They all measure within normal limits. Over here, this is just ventricular fibrillation. It is a more organized coarse VFib because you can see some definitely wide complexes here, and I think this, a lot of people try to look at this and call it a torsades de pointe, but if you really trace it out, it doesn't have that true torsades look to it. With torsades, we're going to have this upwards reflection of ETEC and then a negative reflection of ETEC, then an upwards reflection of ETEC and then a negative. And it's called torsades because it has this ribbon-like appearance. So if you looked at it, it would look like a piece of ribbon that you twisted. So this is just going to be VF, or ventricular fibrillation. So I have a sinus rhythm at 60 beats per minute into VF, ventricular fibrillation, or you can call it VFib. Now I just wanted to point out something very interesting about this strip and probably what happened to this patient. So we did kind of start out with the torsades, and torsades just degrades very, very quickly down into VFib because it's just a rhythm that's really not conducive with life at all. Basically what's happening with torsades is our irritated pacemaker site is just moving back and forth throughout the ventricles. But if you look here, if we're just looking at this beat, so I have a sinus beat here and then a PVC right here, and I'm just going to darken it so you can see it. So probably what happened with this patient is something we call an R on T phenomenon. And this is when a PVC happens too close to a QRS complex. So we know the QRS complex is depolarization of the ventricles. And then we have our T wave, which should follow, and that is the repolarization of the ventricles. And what happens when our PVC gets too close to that QRS complex is we get depolarization trying to happen during repolarization, and it just crosses the energies and it can throw a patient into that ventricular fibrillation. Going over to the next page, we're just going to be looking at figure 6.34, number 33. We can see right off the bat this rhythm is very regular. So I put regular there. My rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 times 10 gave me that 70 beats per minute. I don't have any P waves here. You can see. And we have a wide QRS complex. So I did measure this out. The QRS I will highlight. It's not the whole complex. A lot of people want to measure from here to here, okay, but it's just this QRS. I have my Q, my R, and my S. So I measured some out here, and I got 4 blocks long, which gave me that 0.16 seconds. My ST segment, so we do have elevation here, and again, that's just because we have that backwards deflection of energy going backwards through the heart. So it's not something that you have to note, but if you do note it, you're just being more specific, and that's okay. My interpretation for this is accelerated idioventricular, or you can just write accelerated ventricular. It's called both things. It's accelerated because my rate is 70 beats per minute, and we know that the regular intrinsic rate of the ventricles is 20 to 40. So it is accelerated for that pacemaker site, but it's not quite tachycardia because it's not over 100 beats per minute. All right, on the next page, I'm going to be looking at this second rhythm here. And I kind of drew all over it, and I'll explain it all in a second here. First, we just want to note, is this rhythm regular or irregular? And obviously we can just put irregular right off the bat because we have this going on right in the middle of it, but even our underlying rhythm is irregular. So that's important in being able to name your underlying rhythm. So if I use my little cheater sheet and I mark off my QRS complexes, you can see that they don't line up really at all. So my underlying rhythm is also irregular. For my rate, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16. times 10 gave me that 160 beats per minute. And for my P waves, so that's why I highlighted some of these areas. And let me erase some of this pencil here so you can see. You can see here I don't really have any defined P waves, and I highlighted these two areas because I have more time between the QRS complexes, so I'm able to see those fibrillation waves. So for my P waves, I have fib waves. Now it's a narrow complex rhythm that's irregular and has fib waves for the P waves, and that's what gives us that atrial fibrillation as our underlying rhythm. Now, I highlighted these complexes here, okay? This is not a PVC. It kind of looks just because it's grouped with it, but if you can see, we do have a P wave, and if we measure out our QRS complex here, it's only 2 blocks long, so that one is actually a sinus beat, all right? And we call that a fusion beat because it's just connecting one rhythm with another rhythm. It's connecting those couplet PVCs to that AFib. But if I look at these two, and I've highlighted them in green, these are my 2 PVCs. So if I measure this one out, it's about 4 blocks long, so I know that it's definitely ventricular in nature. They do both look the same. They're very wide and bizarre, so I don't even really need to measure those out to define them as PVCs. And there's 2 in a row, so that's a couplet. So for my interpretation, just looking at this first part, the underlying rhythm, I have uncontrolled AFib at 160 beats per minute. It's uncontrolled because the rate is over 100 beats per minute. You may also see that labeled as AFib with RVR. And RVR means rapid ventricular rate. And usually we call it AFib with RVR if the rate is over 150 beats per minute, because we know that our cardiac output's going to drop. So we just kind of single that one out by calling it RVR. So you may hear that term being thrown around. For the second part, I have with unifocal couplet PVCs. Unifocal because they both look the same, couplet because there's 2 together. And then I did notice some ST depression, but it's very small, and that's why I darkened this isoelectric line here so you could see that it is about 1.5, 2 blocks here, so we do want to consider throwing that in there. Looking at number 38, or figure 6.39, this one should be pretty easy. So this is a systole. We have absolutely no electrical activity going on here. Now if you do look over here, we do have some waves here, and that could be anything. That could be the patient, someone bumping the patient, or someone bumping the cords on the monitor. If you're in an ambulance, it could be some road movement, but because I don't have that happening throughout, we're just going to call this a systole. If I did have these little tiny waves throughout, I could consider it a fine VFib. But again, we have absolutely nothing going on here, so this is going to be a systole. There's absolutely no electrical activity in the heart. Usually this has a poor outcome with patients just because, at least with VF, we have electrical activity there. We just need to reset it. With a systole, we have no electrical activity going on at all. And the number 1 cause of a systole would be hypoxia. All right, we're just going to be looking at the middle rhythm for this one. And so this is number 40, or figure 6.41. Now obviously I've highlighted our very wide, irregular, bizarre looking beats. So those are our PVCs, and those are highlighted there in green. For my rhythm, I put regularly irregular. You can just put irregular because it is irregular. I'm just defining it a little bit more. It is irregular. I'm saying it is irregular, but there's still a pattern to it. For my rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So times 10 gave me that 80 beats per minute. For my P waves, obviously I do not have any P waves for these ventricular complexes, but I do have P waves for my sinus beats. They all look the same, they're all upright, and I have 1 for each complex. My pure interval I measured on a sinus beat because I don't have P waves for my PVCs, and my QRSs I measured for a sinus beat as 2 blocks. Now I did measure one of the PVCs over here, so this is my QRS, so that's where we're measuring to, okay? And I got 4 blocks long. Now we shouldn't have to measure that. We can look at that and see that it's a very wide, bizarre looking complex. So we can already just tell by looking at it that it's ventricular in nature. Now for my interpretation for this, I put sinus rhythm at 80 beats per minute, so it's my underlying rhythm, with bigeminal PVCs. And I put bigeminal because there's a pattern to this. So it's every second beat I have a PVC, and then here looks like it's going back into a sinus rhythm again. But for this section of the rhythm, for the majority of the rhythm, I have my PVC happening every other beat or every second beat, which we call bigeminy. Sometimes we see it as ventricular bigeminy. But here I just put bigeminal PVCs. Now you can put bigeminal unifocal PVCs, but given that this is a pattern, it doesn't necessarily have to be included. But again, the more specific you want to get, the better. All right, moving on to the next page. I'm looking at number 42, or figure 6.43. And my rhythm is irregular, so we have a few different things going on here. This is showing a defibrillation, so we've had some kind of shock given to this patient. For my rate, I just measured one of these out as 35 blocks, and it gave me 40 beats per minute. I don't have any P waves, so I have no PR interval. And my QRS, so this is my QRS, complex ends here, starts here, and it measured out to be 4 blocks, so 0.16 seconds. That means it's going to be ventricular. Now, just looking at this section, we have VFib, so it's just that quivering of the ventricles. We had some kind of electricity applied here, and then we went into, some kind of rhythm. And when we first come out of a ventricular fibrillation, it's usually very irregular. Sometimes it may not even represent an actual rhythm. You just kind of get these bizarre looking complexes. And the idioventricular escape or ventricular escape rhythm is really common to see after a shock. So I have ventricular fibrillation into idioventricular escape, or you can just call it ventricular escape rhythm, at 40 beats per minute. It's just going to be ventricular escape because it has the regular intrinsic rate of the ventricles. So it means our pacemaker escape has escaped to the ventricles because it's between that 20 to 40 beats per minute. Slide this up a little bit. We're going to look at number 43, or figure 6.44. Rhythm is definitely irregular. We have a few different rates going on here. For my rate, because it's so irregular, I actually figured out what the rate of my underlying rhythm was. And that's because this has obviously got its own rate, and it's just very not representative of what the actual underlying rate is for this patient. So I counted the small blocks between two of my RR complexes, and I got 17 small boxes. 1,500 divided by 17 gave me that 88 beats per minute. For my underlying rhythm, I do have P waves for every QRS complex. They are narrow, so my underlying rhythm is going to be sinus, and these are all my sinus beats here. Now we have a couple things going on. So I have my sinus rhythm at 88 beats per minute. From here to here, let me highlight it in green. This is a run of VTAC, okay? So you can see I have 4 ventricular beats right in a row. We consider a run of VTAC to be 3 PVCs or more. So even if it was just 3 PVCs, we would also consider that to be a run of VTAC. And we can tell by looking at it that they're very wide and bizarre looking, so we can definitely see that they're ventricular. If I did want to measure it out, it would be my QRS. So it would be 4 blocks across, would be 0.16 seconds. So I have my 88 beats per minute with a run of VTAC. And then I also have a PVC over here, so and one PVC. So here's my QRS. We can see that it is about 4 blocks as well. So my QRS. So definitely something we don't need to measure out. It looks very wide and bizarre. This beat right here looks very wide and bizarre compared to the sinus beats. So that's my PVC. So this would be a sinus rhythm at 88 beats per minute with a run of VTAC and 1 PVC. Kind of important here to get that underlying rhythm rate because we know that they're not consistently running at VTAC, so we don't want it to mess with our rate. Finally, we're going to look at this last rhythm on this page, number 44, figure 6.45. Regular or irregular. It's irregular because of these two complexes over here. My underlying rate is regular. For my rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 times 10. Gave me the 130 beats per minute. I do have P waves for my sinus beats, so you can see them here. Obviously for my wide ventricular beats, there's no P waves. I measured a PR interval for a sinus beat, and I measured a QRS for my sinus beats. For these ones, it would be my QRS. So I actually got 5 blocks across, so we can glance at that and tell that it's wide. But if I did want to measure it out, it would be 0.2 seconds, and then this one would be QRS. My QRS ends here, where that little notch is. This is going to be about 4 blocks long. So they're both wide. Again, we can definitely tell just by looking at it that they're wide. Don't necessarily have to measure those out. And these are going to be my PVCs. Now my PVCs both look very, very different from each other. So I have a sinus tachycardia because my underlying rate is 130 beats per minute. So sinus tachycardia at 130 beats per minute with multifocal PVCs because it's coming from different areas in the ventricle, and that's why they have those different appearances. So if this is my heart and these are my ventricles, I may have one coming from here, and then I may have one coming from over here, or maybe up here. They're coming from different areas. So I have different areas of excitability in my ventricles. This is a little bit more concerning because it means my ventricles have more irritability than just having one place that's irritable. So sinus tach at 130 beats per minute with multifocal PVCs. All right, going to the next page, I'm looking at the first rhythm up here, number 45, figure 6.46. It is regular, even though it's very wide and bizarre looking, does march out regular. You can see my isoelectric line kind of moves here, and that doesn't make it irregular. What's happening there is the patient may be taking a deep breath, may be being moved, or maybe the cords are being moved. So it is regular. For my rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, and I put 180 to 190 because this one's halfway cut off. So some people count that, some people don't. Beats per minute. I don't have any P waves. Obviously, this is a wide QRS complex rhythm, so it's going to be ventricular in nature. And I did try to measure out a QRS complex here, being 4 blocks long, but it's very hard to see in VTAC. But again, we know with VTAC it's that very unique looking rhythm, so we can kind of glance at that and tell that it's a wide complex rhythm. If you compared this to an SVT, you would definitely be able to tell the differences. So my interpretation is ventricular tachycardia, VT, or you can write VTAC. Also called monomorphic ventricular tachycardia, if you want to get specific, at 180 beats per minute. Going down to number 46, regular or irregular. Definitely irregular. My rate is only 20. I have 2 beats times 10 gave me that 20 beats per minute. I have no P waves, so no PR interval. My QRS complex, I measured out here my QRS. and it gave me 4, maybe even 4 to 5 blocks long, which gave me that 0.16 seconds. My ST segment we don't have to worry about because it's ventricular. So this is an idioventricular or idioventricular escape, ventricular escape rhythm at 20 beats per minute. If you're just going to write ventricular, make sure you're writing escape with that rhythm. This patient may actually be a cardiac arrest because having a rate of 20 beats per minute is not really conducive with life. So a lot of times we see this in the dying process with our hospice patients, or we see it right after cardiac. We get return of spontaneous circulation after cardiac arrest. We may see some rhythms like this. We're going to look at number 47 or figure 6.48. My rhythm is irregular, mostly because of this guy right here. I did put in parentheses, my underlying rhythm is regular. My rate, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, times 10, gave me that 70 beats per minute. I do have P waves with my sinus beats, and they are upright and they are all uniform. My PR interval I measured here, it is 0.2 seconds, which is long, but is still within normal limits. My QRS for my sinus beats is narrow, only measuring 2 blocks. And then we can tell just by looking at this guy that it's pretty wide. It does measure out to be at least 4 blocks long. So my QRS, it's right there, okay. And then looking at my sinus beats, we definitely have some ST elevation. So my QRS, there's my J point, well above the isoelectric line. So there's definitely some ST segment elevation there. This is definitely something that we want to note because this patient could be suffering from an MI. So my interpretation, I have 1 PVC here. So I have a sinus rhythm at 60 beats per minute. Sorry, this should be 70 beats per minute. With 1 PVC and ST elevation, but I do have 1 PVC here. And it's definitely early. And remember we talked about earlier on the R on T phenomenon? I would definitely be worried about that happening here because this PVC happens right on that T wave. So this patient is definitely at risk for going into VFib. All right, we're just going to look at the last page here and we're just going to look at this last rhythm. My rhythm is irregular, basically because of this last part over here. For my rate, this last part, we're not actually going to count that rate because this is actually torsades, and we're going to talk about that in a minute. But so I counted my rate for just my sinus rhythm. I got 23 blocks between the QRS complexes, and 1500 divided by 23 gave me that rate of 65 beats per minute. Now my first half of my rhythm is going to be a sinus rhythm. Everything measures out within normal limits. It's got a P wave for every QRS complex. I do have some ST segment depression here. But I wanted to talk about this part over here. So this is torsades, and you can see we have a VTAC, and you can see it's just switching poles. So it's going from a positive VTAC into a negative VTAC, and that's what that torsades is. It's a very different looking rhythm. So for my interpretation, I have sinus rhythm at 65 beats per minute into a polymorphic VTAC, or we commonly hear it called torsades de points. And torsades de points means twisting around a point. So it is just ventricular tachycardia. My pacemaker site is just moving from one area of the ventricle into another area, back and forth. And that degrades very quickly into VFib.